Welcome along to another Star Trek Reflections deep dive video with me, Peter. I'm a lifelong Star Trek fan who is going on a journey of discovery of all Star Trek that's ever been produced. We are getting through the original series of Star Trek really well, and we are up to the episode which is called Dagger of the Mind. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. This episode begins without a captain's log, and an immediate thumbs up from me is this opening shot of the Enterprise, which looks absolutely beautiful. Not only the ship, but it is orbiting an absolutely wonderful looking planet, which has rings around it. Now, this is a change from the original effects. The remastered effects for this one chose to have rings around this planet, which I think looks absolutely wonderful. We cut to the transporter room where we get a close-up of some cargo that is being transported down. And this is clearly marked. It says caution, infrasensory drugs, destination, Tantalus penal colony for the attention of Dr. Tristan Adams. So we're getting some early scene setting. We get a transporter technician loading this cargo onto the transport pads. We get some very old-fashioned looking filing boxes there as well, which take me back to some of my early jobs working for law firms in the UK. And then the technician goes back to the transporter controls. The transporter chief is there. I don't recognize either of these actors, actually. They start their operations. They say, stand by to beam down, and transporter chief says, energize, and then nothing seems to happen. And they look at each other confused. They don't quite understand what is going on. At this moment in time, wouldn't you know it, Kirk walks into the transporter room. If you're the transporter chief and his technician here, you're thinking, oh, great, the boss is here and it's not going well. Not what you want. Kirk gets a little glint in his eye, a little knowing expression from the seasoned, experienced captain of the Enterprise. And he walks around and goes in between the chief and his technician and says, having some problems here, Mr. Berkeley? And Mr. Berkeley replies, I just don't understand what's going on, sir. Kirk then reminds him, you're transporting cargo down to a penal colony, Mr. Berkeley. And Berkeley immediately realizes his mistake. The security force field, sir. Wonderful stuff indeed. Kirk calls down to the planet's surface and asks for the security screen to be lowered so they can beam down their cargo. And there we go, we energize, down goes the cargo to the planet's surface. Kirk inquires to the transporter chief, is there any inbound cargo for us to transport aboard? And the chief replies, yes, there is just one package, which is bound for the Central Bureau of Penology in Stockholm, in Sweden, which is a place that I visited not too recently, actually. Stockholm is a beautiful city in Sweden, and it's somewhere I'd always wanted to go, and I got to go there for work quite recently in January this year. And I particularly enjoyed visiting the Old Town, where my host took me to a wonderful Viking bar. If you ever get the chance to go to Stockholm, please do take that opportunity and go to the Old Town. It's really beautiful. Anyway, I digress. What's interesting about this, though, is the Enterprise is taking aboard cargo. It's bound for Stockholm in Sweden, in Europe, on planet Earth. And why would the Enterprise be taking on this cargo? I doubt very much on their 5-year mission that they're going to be earthbound anytime soon. But perhaps they're going to rendezvous with another ship that's going to take that the rest of the way. So who knows what the schedule is. Anyway, the cargo is beamed aboard, and it is one quite sizable box which looks quite heavy. On it says, classified material, do not open, and it indeed says that this is bound for the Bureau of Penology in Stockholm. So cargo is aboard. Kirk then turns to the transporter chief and says, you might want to remind yourself on transport regulations and procedures for penal colonies, to which Berkeley replies, immediately, sir. He seems quite embarrassed about his earlier mistake. Kirk then goes easy on him and says, you might want to put that cargo away first before you do it, though. With that done, Kirk exits the transport room, as does the transporter chief. The transporter technician then turns and starts working on a clipboard and pen and looking at a panel on the back of the transporter room. And we cut to this box that has been beamed aboard, and it begins to open. And inside is a man. This is not what we were expecting. And this man, he has an oxygen mask on. He's quite an older man. He's got white hair. He looks of a particular age. I would say he's probably in his 50s, although who knows? This is something that I always notice about shows of certain times. I think with generations, people have started looking progressively younger with each generation. So this actor is Morgan Woodward, actually, and maybe we can look up how old he was at the time. But again, I'm going off track, but transporter technician is completely unaware of the danger that is approaching him as this man climbs out of the box, sneaks up behind him, and whacks him on the back of the neck, rendering him unconscious. So this is not at all what we were expecting. The man who is intruding on the Enterprise here goes to exit the transporter room. There are people walking in the corridors, and he quickly darts back in to cover his tracks, and we close to the opening credits. Opening credits are done, and we get the episode title on screen, Dagger of the Mind, with a shot of the Enterprise. Nothing special in terms of remastered effects here. This one was obviously not given massive amounts of attention, although saying that, we did have the rings on the planet. We had a captain's log stating that they're having a brief stop at Tantalus penal colony to deliver supplies, and they've picked up one box. Now they're heading out of orbit. A very quick whistle stop. We see Spock at the science station, we see Uhura at communications, and we cut to Kirk, who's at his command chair. Bones is there as well in his medical tunic, and Kirk is lamenting the fact that he feels like he's missed the opportunity to meet Dr. Adams. Dr. Adams is obviously someone who Kirk regards in the highest esteem. Quickly, business is interrupted though. Uhura says that they are receiving a communication from the Tantalus colony, and an audio transmission comes across saying, "We are missing one of our inmates. This is a potentially violent case. Please take all precautions." Whilst this is going on, we cut back to the transporter room where our intruder from Tantalus has taken the transporter technician's coveralls and donned them. He's basically changed from a blue outfit to a red outfit of identical style, if you like. So he doesn't look that much different, but changed he has. He's going to try and pass himself off as a engineering technician. On the bridge, we're getting the tail end of this message. It's being repeated. This is a potentially violent case. Kirk is listening intently. McCoy standing at the side of his command chair. Behind them are Brent and Leslie Watch. We've got Brent and Leslie in red uniform there, also listening intently to the situation. Kirk orders, red alert, we have an intruder aboard, take all necessary precautions. The intruder is in the corridors of the Enterprise by this point, and he hears this, and he's taking all steps to not be noticed, but he doesn't succeed for very long, because an Enterprise crew member wearing a yellow shirt, who I think, in looking at him, might be the same guy who played Crewman Sturgeon in The Man Trap, and the phaser technician in Balance of Terror, stops him, doesn't recognize him. I mean, on a ship of 428 people, I doubt you're going to recognize everybody, but there's something suspicious enough that this guy challenges him and says, "Hey, you from engineering." And the intruder runs off. The officer doesn't attempt to challenge the intruder, but instead calls the bridge and alerts the location of the intruder. There's further communication with Tantalus actually at this point, and this is not just with whoever was initially communicating with them. They get through right to the top man of Tantalus. We hear the voice of Dr. Adams, and Dr. Adams comes across as very concerned sounding, but also very apologetic. And it's established during this time that they know that they've definitely got an intruder aboard. And Kirk relays this to Dr. Adams. Meanwhile, Below decks again, we get more shots of the intruder, who easily disables a security officer by sneaking up behind him and disarming him. So security on the Enterprise is not doing a very, very good job here. And at this point, we cut back to the bridge, and a security officer enters the bridge and takes up station just outside the turbo lift. Spock and McCoy then have a very interesting but brief debate about the ethics and the wisdom and ultimately the logic of how Earth people take care of their criminal element by incarcerating him in this way, to which McCoy cheekily and rather cynically jibes back at Spock, "I am sure that you Vulcans found a better way of dealing with your own criminal element." To which Spock responds calmly, we implemented logic, Doctor. We discovered logic." And that is the end of that brief conversation, which then leads into a scene which is a massive thumbs down for me. And again, the ineptitude and the inefficiency of the security aboard this ship. I suppose it's there to tell a story, but the turbo lift doors open and our intruder arrives, and he immediately disables this very, very inept and unprepared security guard who was stationed at the turbo lift for this exact eventuality. So immediate fail there. Our intruder then points a phaser at our bridge crew, and he demands asylum. Kirk goes straight into leadership mode here. He's very calm and collected, and he is immediately in control and said, at gunpoint, "I'm not going to negotiate with you." He's very, very calm and collected here, and this does not take long as our intruder protests that "I want asylum first before I put the phaser down. I won't go back there. You can't make me go back there." Quickly, Spock and Kirk between them manage to distract the intruder. Kirk then manages to give him a bit of a punch while Spock comes behind and gives him the Vulcan nerve pinch, to which Kirk says, "Get him to sickbay." Kirk then orders reverse course to take us back to Tantalus Colony, and we get a beautiful shot of the Enterprise turning around to head back from where they've just come. We cut to sickbay next, and our intruder is on a biobed. He's restrained down. Kirk is there with McCoy, and they're looking at his vital signs, and this guy is clearly very, very agitated. A brief exchange results in Kirk saying to McCoy that this is not our problem. We're going to drop him back off at Tantalus and hand him back over to the proper authorities, to which our intruder gets very, very upset and calls Kirk some very, very unkind words. He calls Kirk, "You smug, button-pushing brass hat." What a great insult that is. I mean, this gets Kirk's attention, and he turns back to him and he says to the intruder, "What did you say your name was?" And the intruder responds, "My name?" And then he tries to say his name. "My name is Simon," and he gets the Simon out. And as he's doing so, the medical monitor starts pulsing rapidly, illustrating the struggle that he's having getting his own name out. And he eventually manages to get his full name out, and he says his surname, which is Van Gelder. And then he continues to try and give more details, and he says, "I was the director of..." And he struggles, and then he manages to get out at the Tantalus Colony. And Bones reiterates to Kirk what he'd earlier said in their brief exchange, that he was getting no sense out of this guy. And Van Gelder continues and says, "I was assistant to Dr. Adams," and he is really, really struggling to get this out. And then he laughs very, very crazily. He then goes on to say that, I knew, but they've erased it." And McCoy quizzed him and says, "Erased?" Kirk re-enters the bridge and goes over to Spock. Spock tells him that they'll be back at Tantalus in approximately 1 hour. Spock then relays what he's found out about their guest, Dr. Simon Van Gelder. So Kirk retorts, "Dr. Van Gelder," and Spock confirms, "Dr. Van Gelder. He was assigned there 6 months ago, not as an inmate, but as Dr. Adams' associate. Kirk, ever more confused at this developing situation, then orders Uhura ship to surface, and the Tantalus colony answers, a female voice answers. Kirk asks to speak to Dr. Adams. Adams quickly comes to the comms, which to me is quite suspicious that he's so readily available. And Kirk then says, "About your missing man," and Adams sort of cuts him off and says, "Yes, Captain, is Dr. Van Gelder all right? And your people, no injuries?" And Kirk relays, "No, sir, no injuries." And then he goes on to inquire, this man, Dr. Van Gelder, and then sort of Adams cuts him off again, says, "We've been very, very concerned about him. Has no harm come to him?" And Kirk relays, no harm at all. "But we thought you might enlighten us as to his condition." At this point, McCoy enters the bridge looking very pensive about all this. Adams relays that Dr. Van Gelder has been doing some experimental work on a beam that they had hoped might rehabilitate incorrigibles. And Van Gelder didn't think he had the moral right to expose something to someone that he hadn't tried on his own person. McCoy approaches Kirk and very, very deliberately says to him, "Jim, that doesn't quite ring true." Kirk asks Adams to stand by, and then he challenges McCoy to explain, and McCoy retorts, I don't believe him, Jim. I can't explain it. But the more I study this patient," and Kirk's not happy with this, you can't explain it, but you don't believe him. And then he defends Adams here. He says, "Dr. Adams has done more to revolutionize, to humanize prisons in the last few years than in many, many centuries. And I've been to those penal colonies since they've begun following his methods. They're not cages anymore. They're clean, decent hospitals for sick minds." McCoy protests, "Jim, listen." And Spock interjects and says, "Gentlemen, I suggest that we ask if Dr. Adams wants Dr. Van Gelder returned." And they both relent, seeing the logic in Spock's argument. And Kirk opens the comms again and says, "Dr. Adams, regarding Van Gelder." Adams responds by saying, "Are you passing any medical facilities on your journey superior to ours? I'd like Van Gelder to have the best possible treatment." Kirk says, "Stand by, please, Dr. Adams. I'll take this up with our ship's surgeon." And he says, "Bones, it's in your court. You care to recommend a better place?" McCoy, not backing down here, says there are no better facilities. He knows that, but that's not the issue. If something unusual is going on down there, McCoy says, "I am required to enter any reasonable doubts in my medical log that requires you to answer in your log." McCoy is standing his ground here. He apologizes for this, but he's standing his ground. "I'm sorry, Jim." And I really, really like this from McCoy. This demonstrates McCoy's medical ethics and who he is, not only as a doctor, but who he is as a human being. And I really, really love this from Bones here. It is a great moment. Kirk sighs, knowing that he's beaten here. He has to go along. He communicates with Dr. Adams, relaying his own feelings of embarrassment. "But by strict interpretation of our Starship regulation, I'm required to initiate an investigation into this so that a proper report can be produced." Adams, ever accommodating, says, "No need to apologize, Captain Kirk. I would take it as a personal favor if you would beam down and look into it yourself. And I'd appreciate if you would come down with a minimum staff, because we're forced to limit outside contact as much as possible." Kirk relays, "Affirmative, Doctor. I've visited rehab colonies before." And he ends the transmission. Kirk then asks Bones to provide someone from his department who has psychiatric and penal colony experience, if possible, to which McCoy says, "Yes, sir." The next scene starts and we get a captain's log, and they are approaching Tantalus colony. We see the Enterprise coming into standard orbit of the planet Tantalus 5. Their mission is a routine investigation and report as per the ship's surgeon's log. And Kirk then relays as to his last entry. He is going to get the chance to meet Dr. Adams after all, but he would have preferred better circumstances. He hands his log recorder to Brent, who takes it away. They call sickbay on Spock's monitor. Kirk's asking for an update on Van Gelder. McCoy relates that he's very, very agitated still, and Spock and McCoy both agree that Van Gelder should stay on the Enterprise and in sickbay. McCoy relays then that he has the expert that Kirk wants to beam down to Tantalus with him, now standing by in the transporter room. Kirk and Spock leave the bridge and head down to the transporter room ready to beam down. In the transporter room, Kirk and Spock enter. Berkeley is there, saying they're locked in on Tantalus. They turn towards the chamber, and in the chamber is Dr. Helen Noel. McCoy had only stated that there was a Dr. Noel waiting in the transporter room for him. Kirk looks astonished at the presence of this young female officer there, and Dr. Noel relays that we've met before at the Christmas party for the science lab. As Kirk enters the chamber, Kirk looks very, very uncomfortable at all this, and Dr. Noel challenges him, "Don't you remember?" And Kirk goes, yes, I remember, clearly not wanting to talk about this, especially not in front of Spock, who looks slightly amused at this situation in a way that only Spock can. Kirk steps off the pad briefly and walks back over to Spock and says, "Tell McCoy she'd better be the best damn assistant I ever had." He steps back up and says, "Energize," and they beam down to the planet. We get a lovely shot of the Tantalus penal colony here on screen. One particular detail I love here in this shot which is remastered, are the rings in the sky which are going around the planet. And this is a very, very different effect than was in the original before this episode was remastered. I do recall that originally the painting that was used for this was the same painting that was used for Delta Vega in the episode Where No Man Has Gone Before. I'm pretty sure that is the case. Anyway, we see Kirk and Noel beaming down, and they arrive. Kirk points towards an open door, to which Kirk says, "This way, I presume, Doctor." And Dr. Noel is saying, "Perhaps it would be simpler if you call me Helen, Captain," since Kirk then cuts her off and says, "This is another time, another place, and another situation." And he quite rightly doesn't appreciate her informality here. She's assuming a lot here, and I like the fact that Kirk is being professional and calling her out on this. And she is being quite inappropriate, to be honest, in this situation. She is an officer aboard the Enterprise. She has a duty to perform, and she is being very, very familiar with Kirk here, and she really shouldn't be. She should know better. And anyway, they move into what looks to be a turbo elevator. The doors close, and this elevator starts very, very rapidly plummeting in a manner that is very, very unexpected to both Kirk and Noel and us as the audience. The reaction of this leads Kirk to basically grab Dr. Noel and hug her closely. And they sort of adjust to the fact that they're in this very, very fast elevator and that it's going down quite a ways and at quite a speed. Noel comments that she wouldn't recommend this elevator for weak hearts, and that is a very astute observation. The elevator comes to a stop, the door opens, and we see for the first time to greet them the face of Dr. Adams. And introductions are made between the three of them, and Kirk says it's a pleasure to finally meet you. And Dr. Adams greets them. He's a very jovial man. He seems very, very relaxed and at ease with himself, and very happy to make jokes, because he says, "Welcome to Devil's Island, Doctor." Noel replies, "Perhaps you will call me Helen, Doctor. With so many titles around, we're not going to be sure who's talking to who." And Adams obliges and says, "I shall indeed." Kirk then goes through procedure and says, "I believe regulations call for me to check my weapon," and he gets out his Type 1 hand phaser. Adams reassuringly says, No, that won't be necessary for you, Captain. Just keep it out of sight, eh? I know you people feel as naked without a weapon as we do without a medikit." And Dr. Adams is very disarming. This is important to note. And the actor who's playing him, and we'll get to him at the end, we'll look all that up on IMDb as usual. But this actor is doing an awesome job at playing this character, and I really like this because he's very disarming. He puts you at ease, makes you feel relaxed, and doesn't make you feel immediately suspicious. The only person who's suspicious of Dr. Adams and what's going on the Tantalus colony so far is McCoy, and this is going to prove to be very important. So Adams invites them to share a drink with him. He says it's such a great day for us here on Tantalus that we don't have visitors very much. So when we do, we don't need any excuse. Kirk tries to call the ship, and Adams reminds him that he won't be able to get through because of the security screen, and Adams releases it, and Kirk calls the Enterprise, and Spock answers. Kirk informs him that his landing coordinates are right on the nose. Mr. Spock, we're here safely. We're with Dr. Adams right now. Kirk out. At this point, the door opens and a female comes into the, presumably what is Dr. Adams' office here, actually, and she is identified as Lethe. She's a very, very elegant young woman dressed in a very, very nice long dress or gown, which is very, very well designed, and I should be very complimentary to the costume department here. We don't often get to see costumes in Star Trek that are outside of the usual uniforms that our cast members wear. So it's quite, not rare, but it's noticeable when you see somebody who's out of uniform. And it's a reminder of just how good these costumes and makeup artists are. And I always like to give appreciation when I notice things like that. But Adams introduces Lethe, is the name of this female individual, and he explains that Lethe came to Tantalus for rehabilitation and stayed on as a therapist, and a very good one at that, I might add. Lethe replies in a very, very blank and almost monotone voice, "I love my work." She's very, very vague, and this immediately raises a look in Kirk's eyes. It's not clear whether Helen notices it as well, but Adams invites him to talk to Lethe. He says, "Before you came here," and she responds, "Before I came here, I was a different person, malignant." He challenges her what her original crime was, and she says, "Does it matter? That person no longer exists." And Adams says, "It's part of our cure, if you will, Captain, to bury the past. Why should a person go on living with unbearable memories if there's no necessity for this?" And he says, "I feel quite sure that you concur with me, Dr. Helen," and then he corrects himself. Helen reinforces that a shifting of memory patterns is quite basic to psychotherapy, Captain. And they continue to distribute the drinks that Adams is preparing, and he says, "A toast, if you will." And Adams says a very, very lovely toast here. I like what he says. He says, "To all mankind, may we never find space so vast, planets so cold, heart and mind so empty that we cannot fill them with love and warmth." And the scene ends with the very blank-looking Lethe, and then we cut to the corridors of the medical facility where we see a couple walking, looking quite happy, but also quite vague, quite blank again. And Kirk thanks Adams as he and Helen and Adams walk through, saying, "Thank you very much, Doctor, a very, very impressive tour." And they walk past a room which Adams is going to take them right past, but Kirk stops him in interest and says, "Doctor, one moment." Adams comes back, chuckling that he was afraid he'd ask about this. One doesn't like to talk about their personal failures, you know. And this is just an experiment that went wrong. And Kirk probes and says, "May I see it?" Helen defends Dr. Adams here and says, "Captain, if something hasn't worked out and therefore has no scientific value," Kirk insists, though, "shall we leave this to the doctor, though?" Helen proceeds to say, "Captain, you brought me down here for my advice." And Kirk rightly states here, and this is a thumbs up from me, one of the advantages of being a captain doctor is being able to ask for advice without necessarily having to take it. And Adams jovially says in that disarming manner of his, "I think I'll have to give that round to the captain. Helen, let's take a look." We cut to the Enterprise here, glorious shot of the Enterprise orbiting the planet with its beautiful rings. And we're in sickbay, and Van Gelder is in no better a state than when we last saw him. He's still on the bio bed, he's still restrained, the readings on the monitor are still all over the place, and he says, "I do not require," and he's trying to get things out, and he manages to get a phrase out, "neural neutralizer," and Spock picks up on this, very, very curious indeed, and he repeats the phrase, "neural neutralizer? Can you explain that, Dr. Van Gelder?" And he goes on to explain as best he can, a room a device, door, control panel. And he's getting the words out, but he can't quite get everything together. He says, a ceiling, a device. He goes on and he's really struggling. A light, this room. And Spock probes, what happens there? And Van Gelder just yells. He cannot control whatever's going on. McCoy goes to hypo him again to calm him down. And respiration signals calm down again, and all is well. Back on Tantalus, they are still looking in this room, and Adams relays the exact phrase that Dr. Van Gelder just mentioned. He says, a neural neutralizer, experimental. And he goes on to casually say, actually, we don't expect to get much use out of it at all. And he points to a man sitting in the chair in this room, and there is a beam from the light above, and he goes on to say that light from above, it neutralizes brain waves, relaxes the patient's mind, does him no harm, of course, and the effects are only temporary. And then Kirk says, well, one question, if it does no good, and Adams cuts him off saying, well, why do we keep using it? He says, yes, hope is why. There's always that chance that it might do some good in the more violent cases, which to me isn't really a good explanation. And then he tries to move them along. So this to me is a red flag, and I think Kirk is slowly putting pieces together that I think McCoy has realized for some time, and certainly Spock on the Enterprise is developing similar suspicions. They exit the room, and Kirk thanks the technician who is attending to the neural neutralizer, who also has a very, very blank look on his face. And as soon as Kirk is out of sight, the technician turns up the dial and said, you will forget all that you have heard. To remember any portion of it, any word will cause you pain. Terrible pain, growing more terrible with every moment as you fight to remember. And the poor man in the chair is looking in absolute agony as he cannot move, and he's stuck in this chair and this light focusing down on him with a high-pitched whirring. We cut back to the Enterprise. Spock is in sickbay still with McCoy. He's communicating with Kirk on the surface, and Spock seems very cagey here. He wants to know where Kirk's location is. Kirk relays that in Dr. Adams' study, and Spock inquires further, then you're with Dr. Adams right now then. And Kirk confirms this. Spock sits down, looking more uncomfortable at this point. And then he relays that Van Gelder has made reference to a particular treatment room. The term was neural neutralizer. And Kirk, on the surface, we cut down there, and Kirk relays that Dr. Adams has relayed to us the mistake that Van Gelder made. McCoy and Spock look at each other, very, very uncomfortable. Kirk senses that there is discomfort in his first officer's voice, and he says, go ahead, Mr. Spock, anything further? Adams realizes what's going on here, and he has a little smirk to himself, and he says that, Mr. Spock sounds like a very excellent second-in-command. Please tell him to speak freely. I do have to go and check in with a member of my staff anyway. Kirk thanks Dr. Adams, and he tells Spock to stand by, and once Adams is out of the room, he says, free to talk, Mr. Spock. Dr. Adams has left his office. Spock relays that Van Gelder is extremely agitated and warns that you are in danger. Noel defends this immediately and says, this is foolish. Kirk relays up that, according to Dr. Adams, Van Gelder caused his own problem. And again, Helen defends this and relays that he's suffering from neural synapse damage, as if his brain were short-circuited. It's no wonder he's having delusions. McCoy pips in and says, received and understood, but we still have some doubts up here, Captain. Can you tell us any more? And Kirk shakes his head and says, not really. Spock says, when do you plan to beam back up, Captain? And then Kirk says, I think we'll spend the night down here, Mr. Spock. This gets Dr. Van Gelder's attention immediately, and he, on the biobed, still restrained, says, no, you can't. And then Spock continues, and you'll continue to check in every 4 hours, to which Kirk agrees, yes, and then they end the transmission. Van Gelder continues to protest and saying, no, don't let him stay down there. You must warn your captain. Don't let him stay. Very, very keen to impart that they are in danger. McCoy goes to hypo him again, but says, no, please don't hypo me. I'll try and fight. I'll try not to fight. I'll try to control it. I will try. You must listen. Warn your captain, Dr. Adams. And then he tries to get it out again. Dr. Adams, but will destroy. And then Spock says, destroy how? What? Van Gelder says, like death. McCoy and Spock glance at each other in absolute confusion as Dr. Van Gelder is trying so hard to get his point across, but he's clearly fighting something that is preventing him from doing so. We cut to an Enterprise log entry which is being made by Spock as acting captain of the ship in Kirk's absence, and he relays in the log that he must now use an ancient Vulcan technique to probe into Van Gelder's mind. This is a first in this series, certainly in production order. We are about to see the first ever use of what we'll come to know as the Vulcan mind-meld, or the Vulcan mind probe. And McCoy looks concerned, comes over and says, "Are you sure about this, Spock? If there's any chance," Spock states that, "I've never used this on a human, Doctor." Now, this is a flag. Getting into spoiler territory slightly here. If you have watched Strange New Worlds, then that's all I'll say. I don't want to get too deeply into that. We'll get to Strange New Worlds in this series at some point in the future, and we'll dissect this retrospectively rather than now. But I thought it would be remiss of me not to mention it. McCoy goes on to say, look, if there's any way we can look into this man's mind to see what he's saying is real or a delusion. Spock then says it's a hidden, very personal thing, part of our private lives. McCoy says, look, Jim could be in real trouble down there. Will this work or won't it? Spock goes over to Van Gelder and relays to him that this could be dangerous. Do you understand? It requires I make pressure changes in your nerves, your blood vessels. Van Gelder says, you must open my mind. Let me warn you, explain to you. And so they begin. Spock reassures Dr. McCoy that this will not affect you. Only the person that I touched. It is not hypnosis. McCoy relays that he understands. Spock makes contact with Van Gelder physically by touching him on the head. He places one hand on the top of his head and the other hand on his neck. And the readings on the biobed monitor are leveling just by doing this. And Spock relays, you are starting to feel a euphoria. Your body floats. Van Gelder confirms, yes, I begin to feel it. Spock says, open your mind. We move together. Our minds are sharing the same thoughts. Down on the planet, there is a buzzer that goes off, and it's revealed that we are in Dr. Helen Noel's quarters on Tantalus 5. She answers the door. In walks Captain Kirk, who says, good evening. She replies back, good evening. Kirk looks pensive, and he says, what do you think of the inmates that we saw here this afternoon? And she says, you could have waited until tomorrow morning until asking me that, Captain. And Kirk just brushes this off and says, well, I didn't. And she replies to the question. She answers, I thought they were happy and well-adjusted. But Kirk says, very importantly, but a bit blank. Which you'd have to be blind not to have noticed the behavior of these individuals. And then she goes on to protest and says, if you're questioning the behavior of a man like Tristan Adams, Kirk says, I'd like to see that treatment room again. And then says, you're familiar with the theory behind it? And she protests again. If you'd simply state any doubts you have to Dr. Adams. But then Kirk rightly says, but if he's lying, then he'll continue to lie. And I won't find out a thing. The only way I can be sure is to see that machine work. Or is that too impractical and too unscientific for me, Doctor? And she has a little smirk to herself, but realizes that she's going to have to go along with this. Kirk goes to the door, it opens, and he says, well, and she says, coming. And she follows him out of the room. Back on the Enterprise, the mind meld continues. Spock says, what is our name? Who are we? We get the answer. We are Simon Van Gelder. Spock then says, Dr. Adams, the neural neutralizer. What did he do to us? And this is wonderful to see. This is really, really good acting by both Morgan Woodward here and Leonard Nimoy. Fantastic. And Van Gelder goes on to say he can reshape any mind he chooses. Quite calmly at this point, I should add. He used it to erase our memories, put his own thoughts there. He was surprised it took so much power. We fought him, remember? But we grew so tired, our minds so blank, so open, that any thought he placed there became our thoughts. McCoy looks horrified at this as he continues, Van Gelder, to say, our mind so empty, like a sponge needing thoughts, begging, empty, loneliness. And the way this is relayed in this scene is wonderfully acted by all three of these actors here. McCoy not even saying a word, but DeForest Kelley acting with just his eyes and his expressions. Very powerful scene with very, very discreet music there as well. Back on Tantalus, Kirk and Dr. Noel have managed to get to the control room unchallenged somehow, which is interesting. And they're at the control panel. Kirk is saying, "I have no desire to damage my brain. Can this be handled with reasonable safety, yes or no?" And Noel says, yes. She seems very, very confident. And Kirk says, "Will you be able to determine if that beam is harming me in the slightest?" And she responds again, "Yes, Captain, I know my profession." Kirk then proceeds to walk round the protective screen and goes over to the treatment chair, and he looks up at the light, the beam that emits from above, which at this moment is dormant. He sits in the chair, he looks over at Helen and says, "Ready?" And she goes, and we'll try minimum intensity, a second or two. And then she turns the dial and the light flashes around. Kirk looks blank for those few seconds. She turns the dial back down again. And then Kirk says, "Anytime you're ready, just for a second or two." And it becomes immediately clear that he doesn't realize that they've already tried it. And Noel relays that, "We've already tried this for that long, Captain." And Kirk says, "Well, nothing happened." And she says, "Well, something happened. Your face went completely blank." Kirk then says, "Try a harmless suggestion." So Helen turns the dial again and she says to him, "You're hungry." As the light whirs again, she then turns the dial down, and then Kirk immediately looks around and says, "When we finally get through with this, I'd like to locate and rate a kitchen somewhere." And Helen smiles and says, "Well, I put that suggestion in your mind, Captain." And Kirk says, "Remarkably effective for a device that Dr. Adams was going to abandon, don't you think?" She then says, "I think we should try this again." Kirk agrees. Yes, pick something unusual this time, an unusual suggestion, something that we can be both sure of. She turns up the dial again, and then she relays a fictional tale of the night that they first met at the science lab Christmas party. She goes on to describe what actually happened. "We met, we danced, you talked about the stars. Now I want to suggest that this happened in a different way, and that you actually swept me off my feet, you gathered me up, and you carried me to your cabin." And we get an imagining in Kirk's mind of how this actually would have come to be, of him carrying her romantically to his cabin. And this to me is highly, highly inappropriate for her to suggest. And we'll come back to haunt this situation in a few moments. So this fantasy plays out, and it ends with, in Kirk's mind, Kirk and Helen embracing, and we cut back to Kirk in the chair, and he's smiling at the pleasant nature of this thought that is being, this experience that has been planted into his brain. But then, in a moment, the technician who was previously manning this neural neutralizer appears, and he takes Helen and moves her out of the way, and in comes Dr. Adams, and the situation becomes very, very sinister very, very quickly. And Adams says, "Now Captain Kirk is going to have a complete demonstration. I want there to be no doubts whatsoever in his mind." He turns up the dial and it whirs again, and things get very, very nasty very quickly here. And Adams says, "You're madly in love with Helen, Captain. You would do anything for her. You would die for her. You would steal for her, sacrifice your career, your reputation." Helen tries to get free and protests. "No, Doctor, no." Adams goes on, "The pain, do you feel it, Captain? You must have her, or the pain grows worse. The pain, the longing for her." And Kirk reacts. "Helen," he cries out. "For years you've loved her, Captain, for years," Adams goes on. And Kirk repeats, "For years I've loved you." Adams reinforces, "You must continue to remember that, Captain." "Now she's gone," he relays. And he turns up the dial again, and the whirring intensifies, and Kirk cries out, "Helen, no, come back, I need you, don't go." Then Adams goes on to say, "Now, Captain, you must take your phaser weapon and drop it on the floor." Kirk does so. He lifts the phaser. He glances down at it. You can tell he's trying to fight this. He knows what's going on, but he cannot refuse. And Adams reinforces, "Captain, the pain gets worse. The more you disobey me." And Kirk repeats, I must drop it." And he does. He drops the phaser. Adams compliments him, says, "Very good, Captain, very good indeed. Now your communicator." And we go through the process again. "Drop your communicator on the floor." Kirk gets out the communicator and he tries again to fight. He tries to open the communicator and he tries to call the Enterprise. Kirk to Enterprise, Kirk to Enterprise. In his mind, in his troubled state right now, in this situation that he's in, clearly not remembering that his signal will not get through because of the security screen. Adams turns the dial up again and the pain gets unbearable. Kirk actually manages to get out of the chair, continuing to try and call the Enterprise on his communicator, and he falls onto the floor in absolute agony. The scene ends and we resume, and we're in what looks to be Kirk's quarters. Well, Kirk is lying down and Helen is tending to him, saying, "They've taken you from the room, Captain. You're in your own quarters now." Kirk wakes up and says, Helen, for years I've loved you." This programmer is clearly stuck in his mind, and he tries to bring her in to embrace her. And Helen says, "He placed all that in your mind. Don't you remember? Dr. Adams took the controls away from me. Do you remember the pain? And then his voice. Remember?" And she manages to get through to Kirk. And this actually illustrates just who Captain James T. Kirk is as a man, because he does come to his senses and he gets up and he realizes, and he has the strength of character, the strength of will to fight this, to fight what has been put into his brain. No ordinary man could do this. And Kirk says, I remember. He looks up at Helen and she smiles at him at first, but then he gets a slightly sinister look in his face, and Helen looks slightly scared, and she retreats back, and Kirk moves towards her, looking as if the programming is going to overtake him again. But Kirk, again, comes back to himself, and he goes over to a vent on the wall, which he starts to pull at, and trying to get this off the wall so they can access the air ducts in the Tantalus system. And he says, "Give me a hand here." And Helen helps him, and they get the door open. Kirk looks inside, and it's an air conditioning system, which he says has to connect with other ducts or tunnels. And he says to Helen, "You can get through this. It might lead to the power supply. Short-circuited, it would cut off the security force field. Have you had any training in hyperpower circuits?" He asks her. Stupid question, really, to which she obviously says no, because she's trained as a medical professional. Kirk says, "Mega voltage. Touch the wrong line and you're dead." But she agrees to this and says anything's better than Adam's torture chamber or chamber of horrors. And she gets in. Kirk seals the vent behind her, just in good time as well, because the door opens and the guards are there. And Kirk says, "Time for another treatment," and off he goes with her. We then cut to Helen, who's in the air conditioning vents. I'm immediately reminded of Die Hard here, if you've ever heard it. When Bruce Willis, poor old Bruce Willis, he says, "Now I know what a TV dinner feels like." What a great scene. But anyway, back to this episode. Helen's crawling through the vents, and we cut to the treatment room again. Adams is there saying, "Please don't fight me, Captain. The pain only gets worse." Kirk back in the chair again, and he's continuing the treatment here as Kirk is in the chair groaning. Adams then says, "You believe in me completely." Kirk repeats it, "I believe in you completely." Adams says, "You trust me completely." Kirk replies this, "I trust you." Adams compliments Kirk at this point, saying, "Excellent, Captain, excellent. Do you know Dr. Van Gelder was down on his hands and knees at this point, sobbing?" He says, "It's so gratifying. I'm so fortunate to have had a couple of excellent specimens to work with. I've learned a great deal." And this goes into Dr. Adams' motivations a bit here. And it's interesting to question, what exactly is he up to here? Why is he doing this? Is he mad? Is he evil? Or is it simple scientific curiosity? Has he justified this in his own brain, that he has the right to do this, to experiment for what he perceives to be the greater good of medical treatment? I don't know. And we don't actually get to that in this episode. We don't ever really get a clear indication of why Adams is doing this. On the one hand, it's frustrating, but it also leaves the audience to make up their own mind as to what Adam's motivations could be. And this is a powerful thing sometimes. I think quite often it's good for an audience to make up their own mind about what's going on in an episode. And I really like this. And again, I'm going to come back to the actor's performance here as Adams, which I really, really like. At this moment, the therapist, ex-patient that we saw earlier, Lethe, comes in and relays that the woman doctor, she's gone, Dr. Adams. Adams says, "Notify security at once, Lethe." And he probes Kirk immediately. "Where is she, Captain? Where is Helen?" Kirk tries to fight it. He says, I don't know. And the dial gets turned up. So, "Where is Helen? And with what instructions?" Kirk tries to get up again, and he manages to succeed. And as he's falling to the floor in pain, he continues to protest, "I don't know," and he falls to the floor. We cut to Helen back in the air vents again, and she's coming to somewhere she can access, and it looks to be, wouldn't you know it, exactly where she needs to be. She's in a power center or control room of some kind, and she manages to easily open this vent and get out into the control room. It looks like a very, very electrical type place, exactly as Kirk has described. So she's done very well to get here. She opens with a deadbolt, the door to a control panel. We cut to the Enterprise. We're now in the transporter room. Spock, now very, very clear what's going on down on the planet, is instructing the transporter chief to say, emergency channel D, to which he replies, Mr. Berkeley, it's no good, Mr. Spock. We can't get a signal through. I can't break through their security force field. Spock says, keep trying. Back in the power center, Helen bolts the little door that she's just opened again as she hears some security guards coming, and she hides out of the way. The security guards move on. At this point, I'm interested to know, is everyone on Tantalus under Adam's spell? All the security guards, all of the patients, has he run this machine over everyone? I think it's very, very clear that he's run it over the guy who was manning the machine earlier, but I don't know. My assumption is yes. I think that, I mean, there are two explanations. He's either had everyone in that chair and wielded his power on them and his will, or that he's done it to majority of the patients and some of the staff, but the security are just doing their job. They're obeying the orders of the head of the colony. But anyway, something you can make up your own mind on again, I guess. We cut back to Helen again. She goes back to this door. She opens it again. She sees a sign for high voltage, so she knows she's in roughly the right place, and she reaches for this switch to pull it down. She struggles a little bit, but she manages to pull this switch down. As she's doing so, the security guard returns and sees her. At this exact moment, we cut back to the Chamber of Horrors. The light goes out. Kirk gets up. Just as Adams and the controller of the machine come round, who we find out his name is Eli here, and Adams instructs him, saying, get him back up, Eli, and find that girl. At this moment, Kirk springs to life. He uses his opportunity that the light is off, and he elbows the controller into the stomach, and then he grabs Adams and whacks him, and then he punches the controller again, and off he goes. Adams falls to the floor. The controller also is incapacitated. We cut back to the power control room. The security guard has overpowered Helen and pushed her to the floor, and he goes back and he switches the high voltage switch back to where it previously was. He then goes over to Helen to presumably try and take her back into custody. She reacts very, very quickly and instinctively, and she kicks him. She brings her knees up to her abdomen, and then she uses all her force to kick him, and in doing so, he lands right on the high voltage and gets electrocuted, and she shields her eyes as the brightness of that electrocution, that unfortunate end for this unfortunate guy who, either way, whether he was just a security guy doing his job or whether he was brainwashed, this guy is a victim, and it's very, very important to point that out. On the Enterprise, Transporter Chief relays, Mr. Spock, the force field is gone. Spock looks over to McCoy and says, grab some security people and follow me down. Spock gets his phaser out as he stands onto the transporter pad and instructs the chief to energize and send him down. Back in the control room, Helen goes over the dead body of the security guy. She picks up his phaser and she goes back through the vents, closes the vent just seconds too early to meet up with Spock, who beams into the control room at that point. Spock sees the security guard and he looks up at the security screen sign. He walks over to it. He opens the panel to it. He acknowledges the signal on his communicator and he relays to the Enterprise that the force field has been eliminated. He then goes on to reactivate the main power in the control room. This is crucial because at this point we cut back to the treatment room. Dr. Adams is still on the floor. He's coming to his senses after Kirk's attack, and he looks up in horror, realizing that the beam is on him and there is nobody at the controls. Where at this point of time Eli has gone, I really don't know. But anyway, we cut back to Kirk, who has wandered back to presumably Helen's quarters. He goes in, phaser in hand, just in time to see Helen return, and he opens the vent for her and pulls her out. She's in his arms, and at this point he actually can resist his programming no longer, and he embraces her, and she tries to explain to him, phaser in hand actually, quite close to his neck there, quite dangerous. She says, Captain, Dr. Adams did this to you, don't you remember? And Kirk sort of starts to come to his senses again. Just as Spock walks in, for possibly my favorite scene of the episode, Spock walks in and sees what's going on here. Kirk and Helen in this embrace. And Spock's look on his face is just priceless. He raises that classic eyebrow of his, and then he has this head tilt, and it's just glorious. And then Kirk comes to his senses and says, "Dr. Adams, the treatment room, follow me." And they all walk out together. We cut to a scene of the main facility, and McCoy is down now with a security team, phasers in hand. They're restraining everyone. A security guard pushes a Tantalus staff member against the wall. McCoy sees Jim. They enter the treatment room. So we've got Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Helen here now. They turn the controls off. Kirk walks around, and he sees on the floor Dr. Adams. Eli, as far as I can tell, nowhere to be seen. I don't think I can see him there. He might be, though. I don't know. McCoy confirms he's dead, Captain. And Helen says, well, the machine wasn't on high enough to kill. But Kirk comments he was alone. Can you imagine the mind emptied by that thing without even a tormentor for company? And this is exactly the situation, exactly the picture that Adams had tried to convey to Kirk about Dr. Van Gelder. This is the lie that he told. And it's ironic that he ended up dying in that exact manner of the lie that he created. The crisis is averted, everyone is safe. We cut back to a lovely shot of the Enterprise orbiting Tantalus, and we are on the bridge. We get a lovely view screen of that beautiful planet again. Spock at the science station gets up, he walks over to the command chair. McCoy is leaning on the chair. Kirk enters the bridge. Uhura relates to Kirk that there was a message from Tantalus Colony. Spock says it was Van Gelder calling, and he said he thought you'd like to know the treatment room had been dismantled, the equipment has been destroyed. Kirk says thank you. Kirk sits in his command chair, pensive. And it's not clear to me here. It's left very ambiguous. What happened to the programming that was imposed upon Kirk here? Was McCoy able to treat him in some way? How did he do so? Or has Kirk just been Kirk here, as we would see many times in future episodes where we think something has afflicted Kirk for which he will need a treatment, but he gets over it. He has the strength of will, the strength of character to be James T. Kirk, to be the man he needs to be, the captain of the Enterprise. I don't know. Again, it's left up to the audience. But McCoy, leaning on the chair behind Kirk, says it's hard to believe that a man could die of loneliness. And Kirk replies, not when you've sat in that room. Kirk looks over to Spock at this point, and he orders his first officer to take us out of orbit, Mr. Spock, ahead warp factor 1. And Spock acknowledges this command. This is a weird one to me because Spock is the science officer, but he's also the first officer. So this would make more sense in the Next Generation if we had the arrangement where the senior officers all sit together in command chairs. But little spoiler alert, it was not uncommon for Jean-Luc Picard to say, get us out of here, number one, and number one would relay the orders to the helm. But it always caught me off guard, this watching this, and it happens a couple of times. I think it happens in the next episode as well, where Kirk would look over the science station, who does not drive the ship. This is not the helm, but nevertheless, it sort of doesn't make sense, but it also does. But it's something worth pointing out, I thought. The episode closes off. It's directed again by Vincent McKeeverty, who has directed a number of episodes, 6 in total, 3 in season 1, 2 in season 2, and 1 in season 3. Enterprise leaving orbit, lovely shot of the Enterprise leaving this beautiful planet, and we go into the main end credits. Music in this episode was composed and conducted by the original composer of the theme, Alexander Courage. Great music, as is always the case in Star Trek. I really appreciated the music in this episode and every episode to date. At some point in time, I will no doubt do a video all about the composers of Star Trek, because I am very motivated by that. Guest stars in this episode, James Gregory as Dr. Tristan Adams, and our other main guest star is Morgan Woodward, along with Marina Hill as Helen Noel. She gets good billing here. She gets Mariana Hill, rather, I should say, as Helen Noel. So that's kind of like a also introducing kind of thing. But I just want to comment on Morgan Woodward, actually. Interesting little fact about him is that he would go on to feature in another episode of Star Trek as a completely different character. He doesn't play Dr. Simon Van Gelder again. He plays someone else. I'll not reveal who. But the interesting thing about that episode that he's in is that it's directed by the same director, Vincent McEverty. I wonder if he had some motivation or some influence in the casting there. So who knows? But that tickled me a little bit. That was interesting. Another thing I wanted to point out is that Morgan Woodward was very recognizable to me as, I mean, he had a stellar career. He's in a lot of things, but the thing that I recognized him from, apart from Star Trek, was Dallas, that old great 70s and 80s and 90s soap opera Dallas with Larry Hagman as J.R. Ewing, but he played a recurring character in that from 1980 to 1987. 55 episodes he was in as an oil man called Punk Anderson. So I loved that show. What a great show indeed. Fantastic. Now, this episode on IMDb, what does this one score? Let's take a look. It gets a 7.4 out of 10. And I think that's there or thereabouts. I like this episode. I think it's got a lot of good themes in it, a lot of good things to get stuck into. I like it. I don't love it. I don't hate it. It's kind of just in the middle. So I'm going to give it a solid 7, which I think is fair. So there we go. And there we have it, another episode in the bag. And I hope you enjoyed that run through of it. If you're familiar with it and have seen it many times, I hope it made you feel nostalgic. If it was new to you, I hope you found it equally enjoyable. Please give me a thumbs up, a like. If you did, that would be most appreciated. It takes a second to do it and it's free. Same thing with the subscribe button. Please do hit that subscribe button. Again, completely free to do so. Costs you nothing, takes a second, and it helps me to grow this channel and reach a wider audience, which I would be very grateful for. I am going to leave this episode right there, wind up the video. I'll thank you once again. I'll be back with another episode very soon, which will be called Miri, as we continue through season 1 of original Star Trek. Okay, you all take care, stay safe, travel well, and above all else, live well and prosper. Bye-bye for now.